I've been doing a couple of these book talks around, and I did one last week in Fergusville Public Library, and it was a room filled with people that I knew well. And I didn't think I'd be nervous, and then my mother-in-law was sitting in the front. But I actually feel like there's a lot of people, some new friends, but a lot of people I met on this journey, and for those of you who don't know, Shannon and Brian and Jim from the Minnesota Historical Society Press are here. Obviously, this book would have happened without them. So this is my book, Perpich, Minnesota original. I wrote it with Lori Sturtevant, and maybe I'll start off just reading a little bit from the prologue, and then I want to just kind of tell you how the book came to be and talk a little bit about it. And there's questions. And I think Marlene Johnson's going to join us at some point. All right, from the prologue. As I entered class that day, my father was unemployed, and I spoke no English, and yet today I have taken the oath of office as the 34th governor of Minnesota. This could not happen in many parts of the world. Read Perpich from his 1976 inauguration. In the early morning hours of Thursday, December 30th, 1976, Minnesota's newly sworn-in governor joined a small inaugural party at the St. Paul Hotel. He'd asked for no official festivities. This party included only close friends and family, relaxing and telling stories. They weren't political insiders from St. Paul. They were gas station owners, dental assistants, and the sons of union miners from Minnesota's remote and often neglected Iron Range. But tonight they were in the private company of the governor. At the center of attention, where he always was, sat the man everyone knew as Rudy. His larger-than-life personality, his big smile, and his swollen right hand immersed in a bucket of ice. Rudy Perpich had been sworn in as Minnesota's 34th governor earlier that day, and he had publicly declared that he would stand until midnight to shake the hand of everyone who came to greet him. It was close to 1 a.m. before the line of well-wishers finally ended. Still, even after 12 hours of handshaking, Perpich was energized. He wanted to shake the hand of every person in Minnesota. The crowds had come to meet the man who had been promoted to the top job from lieutenant governor after Governor Wendell Anderson resigned. They came from the Twin Cities and from small farming communities. They dressed in suits, working clothes, jeans, and formal wear. They stood in line for hours to wish Perpich well in his new position. As one observer said, they represented large business, small business, special interest groups, organizations, but mostly they just represented themselves. Perpich's day had begun with a polka mass at the Church of Assumption in St. Paul. Father Frank Perkovich, who won a Lifetime Achievement Award from the National Cleveland-Style Polka Hall of Fame, officiated the service. He referred to the new governor by his familiar name of Rudy, but also as the father of the family of Minnesota. Perkovich's band, the Polka Masters Orchestra, consisting of an accordionist, guitarist, bass player, and drummer, provided Yugoslavian ballads and church music to a crowd that overflowed the 1,000-seat church. After the service, Perpich, along with his wife Lola, his daughter Mary Sue, his son Rudy Jr., and his parents Anton and Mary, were chauffeured to the inauguration, which was to take place at the state capitol at noon. Giving Judge Gail Murray, one of the few female jurists in the state, administered the oath. Her inaugural role was a harbinger of the intentions of a governor whose appointments of women to the courts would reshape the state's judiciary, and who would appoint more women and minorities to official positions than any governor in Minnesota history. The Capitol had the elbow room of the small-town gymnasium as several thousand people packed the marble rotunda and crowded the balconies to witness Perpich's remarks. The Hibbing High School band fired up the crowd before and during the ceremony. Perpich wore a dark blue three-piece suit that he had bought specially for the ceremony. As a student of gubernatorial history, Perpich joked with reporters that he was cautious about buying the suit. The last lieutenant governor to face a similar circumstance in 1923 had purchased a new suit only to have the then governor change his mind about stepping down. But Perpich's focus on his clothing purchase was more than superstition. His reservations about a new suit tied back to his childhood. So did much of what he had to say that day, and so did much of what would become one of the most most consequential gubernatorial tenures in Minnesota history. I'll stop there and say, yeah, again, this is the book, Perpich, Minnesota Original, by Minnesota, published by the Minnesota Historical Society Press, released on April 22nd, a few weeks back. Written along with Lori Sturtevant, who many of you know Lori, someone I've always admired. I consider one of the foremost political observers and historians that we have in our state. She has a wealth of knowledge. This is truly remarkable. It was just an honor for me to work with her. And Governor Mark Dayton looking forward to it. He called me last night to check in and see how things were going with the book. He was reading it again. We sent him an advance copy, of course, to give him the forward for the book, but he was reading it. He said, there's a lot of stuff in there that I didn't know. So maybe I'll just start with a little bit, tell you on how the book came to be. And so it was October 2017. I remember specifically I got a call from Bemidji Mayor Rita Albrecht. Some of you might know Rita. She was Bemidji mayor at the time, mayor of Bemidji at the time. And she called and said, Ben, I want you to come to Bemidji. We're having there's a group of mayors from the Twin Cities, from the Regional Council of Mayors. We're coming up to Bemidji and they want to talk about the rural-urban divide and how we as mayors can help bridge this divide. And so I went there, and it was Jake Spano from St. Louis Park, and Jim Hubble from Edina, and Molly Cummings from Hopkins was there. And anyway, there was a number, there was 5 or 6 metropolitan mayors, and there was mayors of Grand Rapids and myself, Rita. We talked about the rural-urban divide. We didn't talk about politics, we didn't talk about policy, we didn't talk about partisanship. We just talked about building relationships around that rural-urban divide. Something in that meeting, something really important happened to me. I realized how important that issue was, how real it was, and I also realized that as mayor, I had an opportunity to do something about it. Right? I had a platform to use, and as someone who really loves history, I started doing some history. And I went to a friend of mine who was the provost of the college in Fergus Falls, which is kind of a thought partner with me, someone I admire, and she said, "You need to read Lori Sturtevant." So I went back and I started reading Lori's columns, and I thought, yeah, she's really good. She talked about Hyde Berman, she talked about Ned Atkins, and some historians and some of the authors that I admired. And so I got the courage up to send Lori just kind of a blind email. I sent an email and said, "Hey, Lori, this is what I'm thinking about," or whatever. And she wrote back this email right away. She said, "Ben," she said, "you're a mayor that I told myself I want to get to know him." She said, "I heard you speak at a League of Minnesota Cities or something." She heard me speak one time. She said, "I want to get to know that." So anyway, that was a friendship that started with Lori and I. So I continued to do some research, and I told her, I said, "I want to write a book about Minnesota's history of overcoming that rural urban divide, right? Our history as a state, our state has a history of rural and urban places coming together to really to do great things. Right? You go with the Minnesota Miracle, and the Minnesota Miracle was there was Democrats and Republicans from outstate. There was Democrats and Republicans from the metro area, and came together to think about what is best for the future of our state. And so I wrote an outline. I said, "Look, Lori, here's the outline of the last 50 years, the last half of the 20th century, and the way that we have overcome political divides and geographic divides in our state." And she said, "That's a great idea. I think I really like that idea." So I sent it off to the Minnesota Historical Society Press, and they're here today, and they said, "Well, that sounds like a great idea, but we don't want to publish that book." but Lori said, "That's a great story, but you're missing one, and that's the story of Rudy Perpich." And so I started down the road of learning about Rudy Perpich. And I remember being at the Minnesota Historical Society here at the archives, and for an amateur historian, that's a little bit overwhelming. There's hundreds of boxes. It felt pretty cool to be there for about the first 5 minutes, and then you're like, "Oh, okay, now what am I going to do with all this stuff, right?" And I just stumbled upon an oral history by Tom Berg. So you probably served with Tom, right? Some of you guys remember Tom Berg. Tom Berg wrote a book published by Minnesota Historical Society Press called Minnesota's Miracle. He wrote a book about so I recognized that name, and it was about 30-page narrative of oral history, and I grabbed it. And I thought, well, this is something I can take. And I read it, and it was really, really well done. And anyway, I thought I did a little research. And I found the lady who did the oral history. And I tracked her down. She was in Omaha, Nebraska at the time. And I contacted her. She said, yeah, I think there's more of those. You need to get. So I kept this winding circuitous route. Anyway, I ended up at the Minnesota Discovery Center in Chisholm, the Iron Range Research Center, and there was 41 of these oral histories, and all but 5 of them had never been out of the basin of the Iron Range Research Center in Chisholm, and they were from people like Paul Wellstone and Mark Dayton, and Lori Sturdivant was one of the people in the oral histories, and it was Anne Brown, who was his aunt, and his childhood friends, and people who served in his cabinet, and his political rivals. There's all these different people and had all these different perspectives. I thought, oh, this is this wealth of new information about how these things happen. To what I thought was, the more I read, was one of the most colorful and consequential periods in our history. And so I wrote up a proposal and sent it off to the Minnesota Historical Society Press. And I didn't hear anything back, but I did hear that they were going to publish. They were going to publish the article. So I wrote one chapter along with it and sent it in. And it was a story about the 1982 campaign when Rudy came back, which is I think that's my favorite story of the book. And we could talk about that a little bit. But I wrote that sample chapter and an outline for what I thought would be a book. And I didn't hear it back, but they did say they were going to publish that article, that chapter as an article in the October 2022 issue of Minnesota History Magazine. And I thought, you know what? That's pretty good. I was proud of that. I said, that's good enough for me. My mom was proud, and that was good enough for me.
Your mother-in-law?
My mother-in-law, yeah. Well, she's never really that proud to tell you the truth. She's a wonderful lady. But that was good. So they came out, and my only regret was that I didn't get the cover. I really wanted the cover because I knew exactly what picture of Rudy I wanted on the cover of that magazine, but that wasn't to be. They chose a different cover, and so I went about my business and went back to life. And it was the first week of January 2023, and my life had changed a lot. My wife and I we started from scratch 2 businesses on the Main Street of Fergus Falls, which took a lot of time. And I was the mayor, and we had 5 kids, so I was a busy person. And we sold the businesses. And I remember just this kind of like, oh, my life is just really kind of peaceful right now. And I was doing some work. This first week in January, I got a call from Henry from Minnesota Historical Society Press. I still remember exactly where I was because I was on my way to Alexandria, driving the car, and I asked myself, I said, hi, Ann, how are you doing? She said, good. How are you doing? I said, good. I said, I'm just driving to Alexandria. Now, anyone who knows Ann, what did she tell me to do? She said, will you get to Alexandria? I want you to get to Alexandria before I talk. I was like, okay. So I just drove really, really fast to Alexandria because I want to know what she had to say. And I got to the hockey rink in Alexandria, and she said, we want to publish the book called Rudy Perpich. And I thought, yes. Now I just have to write it. And so that was in January 2023. And it was the last, and I think I delivered the manuscript in July 4th of 2024, so it took a little bit, about a year and a half. So it was a labor of love, and working with them was an absolute privilege. But the reason, one of the main, so going back to Lori's comment, she said, I think you're missing the story of Rudy Perpich. And through those oral histories, she was right. The story of Rudy Perpich was fascinating. To me, the more I learned, the more I was fascinated. And to me, it's really important to go back to connect it back to that meeting of May 2017. It was about bridging that rural urban divide. And I think the story of Rudy Perpich, I think there's few stories in Minnesota history that better illustrate Minnesota's example to cross those divides, to work as an entire state, to see a vision of the entire state and what we can be. And it's really a fascinating story. I mean, it's a story of comebacks, it's a story of wins and losses, it's a story of the Mall of America and the Chopstick Factory. some of you remember the Chopsticks Factory? And, it's the story of the Center for Victims of Torture. It's the story of the first female lieutenant governor. And it's the story of, so many, it's the Gorbachev. There's so many great stories in there. But ultimately for me, it's the story of the son of an immigrant who grew up in a mining location, not even a town, in a mining location without running water, in deep poverty, who entered kindergarten not able to speak English. And he rose to be one of the most consequential political figures in Minnesota history. And so to me, it's a wonderful story. How he got there, I think he's remarkable. And how he got there is remarkable, and what he did once he was there is even more remarkable. And how he was able to really set the stage for where we are today. Minnesota exceptionalism, I think we owe a lot to Perpich, especially in the 1980s. So, 5 takeaways for me, 5 things that kept coming up in the book. I think they're important to the story of Rudy Perpich. First is it's that place, right? The Iron Range. For those of you who've been there, who know there, have a connection there, it's a special place, right? And that shaped who Rudy was. And I think that his ability to connect with people across the state was critical to what he was able to achieve as governor, and to bridge that rural urban divide. And Paul Wellstone was pretty good at connecting with people. Paul Wellstone said there's nobody that he had ever met that was better than Rudy Perpich one-on-one, just connecting with people. And he did it just in the coffee shops, wherever he could go. And there's a number of good stories about him and how he connected with, how he's able to connect with people. One is the bicentennial. So Rudy, he came from nothing, right? Like he came from, again, just deep poverty on a mining location in Iron Range, and he knew, and he worked his way up. He worked his way up, but he knew he would not. He knew that the state of Minnesota would not elect someone from the Iron Range to be governor. He knew that his only opportunity to be governor was to be lieutenant governor. And so the story of how he did that through working his way up through the state senate, through the Hibbing School Board, through the state senate, ran for lieutenant governor, and at a time when he didn't run on the ticket the first time he ran. So there's a remarkable story there. But then he used that office in the bicentennial. So it was 1976. He used the bicentennial to go to every single little town in Minnesota and meet with people one-on-one. Just used that to gain. That was his. He worked harder than anyone. So, and the other story that comes to mind is the. Some of you remember the power line controversy in the 1970s. I do, because it's from my neck of the woods, right? It's from Grant County, but it was a pretty significant controversy. I mean, they were tipping down 250-foot power lines. I mean, it was a major. I mean, it was a pretty major deal. When Rudy confounded everyone, including the press, but the state troopers and his staff, he just left. He would just leave the governor's residence, get in his car, drive himself, and he shows up in Grant County, this little tiny town of Lowry, Minnesota, population 350, shows up at the bar and says, can you give me directions to the Rutledge Farm? Anyway, so the bartender calls the Rutledge Farm and says, there's some guy here who wants directions to the Rutledge Farm. Ask him who he is. He says he's the governor of the state of Minnesota. So I don't know who that joker is, but give him directions. The next thing you know, Rudy Perpich is knocking on his door. But that's how he was. He would connect with people on that level. And I think that those who knew him well would know that was not always the most effective. He had to grow into that as a story. So the second thing I think is the second takeaway is it's a story of he was always the underdog, right? He was always the underdog. He was always the maverick. He was fighting his party, and in the story of comebacks, right? Like, so he lost how well people know the story, but he lost in '78, along with just about every other Democrat in the state, in the Minnesota Massacre. And there's a story about that. Wendell Anderson, who was the governor, Walter Mondale, who's the United States Senator, is appointed as, or he's elected as the vice president. Wendell Anderson resigns. They have it all planned out. Perpich will then become governor, and we'll appoint Wendell Anderson to the United States Senate. Nothing can go wrong with this plan, right? Except for the voters didn't quite like the way they did that, right? So then, in 1978, you had the Minnesota Massacre. But I would argue that had that not happened, that Minnesota Massacre in 1978, probably wouldn't be standing here. I think Rudy Perpich would have been a colorful governor that served, 1.5 terms, and probably wouldn't know a lot about it. But that time period that he spent in Vienna, so when he lost in '78, went to Vienna, and part of the reason he went to Vienna, I believe, is because, and this ties into, he had a mentality to always look forward, never look back. And tying that back to place, when he was very young, he had a sister who was killed in a tragic accident, and they didn't talk about it. In fact, in those oral histories, it was really interesting that there was about 3 or 4 people who mentioned that story, but they mentioned just little bits of it because nobody talked about it. They knew that there was something about his sister who was killed when she was just an infant, and she poured scalding water. Her mother was, Rudy's mom was boiling water on the stovetop. She mistook it for bath water. She poured it on herself, scalded herself. It was a tragic accident. And Rudy's mom never really recovered from that. You can imagine why. And Rudy saw that in his mom, and I think he recognized that you can't live in the past. You always have to look forward. I think that really shaped him. And so there's a number of things throughout the book, times when he's looking forward, he's not looking back. He takes defeat, he goes forward. But the most important one to me is that 78. He went in '78. He realized he had to make himself better. He wasn't going to look back. He's going to hang around Minnesota. He ended up. He called up Bill Norris from Control Data. Some of you guys might know Control Data. And he said, I speak Croatian. I need to be your Eastern European envoy for your company. And he was. So he went over to Vienna for 3 years, and that experience shaped Rudy Perpich, who he was, came back, and the Rudy Perpich of '82 was something special. And, the story's still on. But so I think that come back, being a Maverick, and when he came back in '82, by the way, the one DFLer who won in '78 was Warren Spanish, as a term general, and people who know the history of Minnesota, he was the heir apparent going into the '82 election. He was the DFL endorsed, and he was he was going to be the next governor. And Rudy took him on in this incredibly guerrilla campaign with RVs, and I mean they had this Tuesday night crew of these. They were all white men up in Hibbing, but they were Rudy Perpich supporters, and they were hawking their shotguns to write checks for the campaign so they could go out and get campaign material and cruise around in these RVs. It's a remarkable story. They don't campaign quite like that anymore. I mean, it's quite amazing. And then education, right? Education. Rudy it was his passport out of poverty. His mother, who I talked about, her dream was to be a school teacher, and her father died in a tragic mining accident when she was 14. She had to drop out of school to work to support her family, and so she instilled education into her children. That was going to be your passport out of the mines. That was going to be your passport out of poverty. And so she had four sons. The daughter died, but the 4 sons. All 4 of those sons ended up with advanced degrees. 3 of them were dentists, and one was a psychiatrist and a medical doctor. So pretty remarkable for 4 boys from poverty. And Rudy chose the first female lieutenant governor in Minnesota history. Her name was Marlene Johnson. And this is Marlene Johnson. Hi, Marlene. Just in time. Thanks so much for being here. And so, so that's pretty remarkable. Education was so important to him. And then he went on to, to do some pretty remarkable things too. And in '85, he came out with his Access to Excellence. Was his plan. And it was 3 things. There was 3 main components. The first was open enrollment, right? That was and the teachers unions did not like that idea of open enrollment, right? And they thought that would be yeah. The second one was post-secondary enrollment options, which kind of got in there a little bit because they were so focused on the open enrollment. But then the one that was really dear to Rudy's wife, Lola, and I have to mention Lola passed away about 10 days ago, and the story of Rudy Perpich is really not complete without the story of Lola. It's together there, which is a real force, right? Their love was inspiring. It was inspiring reading newspaper articles from the 1970s about them. Like that's how much of a couple they were, right? And you can see it in the pictures. But her passion was the arts and education and culture, and she was the force behind the Perpich Center for the Arts, Perpich Arts School. And I know that's everywhere I go, someone has a story of connected to that Perpich Arts School. But it's interesting, all the opposition that Access to Excellence had, the one that he would not let go was that art school, because it meant so much to Logan. Rudy had a belief in government. It was a positive force. Rudy got his first pair of eyeglasses. He had his dental visits from school. His first pair of eyeglasses. He went to college on the GI Bill. He just saw. Rudy had a fundamental core belief in government as a positive force in people's lives, and that was his driving force. It was Marlene, the work that Rudy and Marlene did together. He appointed the first female Supreme Court justice in Rosalie Wall in '77. On the last day in office, he appointed Sandra Gardner, which gave Minnesota the first majority female Supreme Court in the state and in the country. As mentioned, 20 more women, minorities than in government before. He really believed in government as a force, a positive force in people's lives, and what you can do with that. And he had a vision of Minnesota as world class, right? He really truly believed in Minnesota as a world class state. In '83, when he came into office, Minnesota was 50th in funding for international trade. The Minnesota International Trade Office was 50th. Within a couple of years, they were up in the top 5. More people were coming from different offices across the nation were coming to see the group in Minnesota. He saw Minnesota as an international player. He saw Minnesota could be world class, and that was the vision really drove who he was. Things like the Mall of America. I mean, they laughed. Governor Goofy, it's really bothered him. But Gorbachev, when he talked about the Gorbachev visit, people laughed. They laughed. He had a vision for things of what could be, but I think it was really special. He always there's a funny story. I'm trying to remember. It was one of his commissioners. It might have been Sandra Gardner. But they were driving down to this. It was one like Minneapolis Army. It was an old building. He goes, that could be a world-class bingo hall. He thought everything could be world-class. But anyway, I'll wrap it up by saying, obviously, he was able to do all these things. To me, this is getting back to that rural-urban divide, and we are definitely obviously divided. He was able to do these things that was not just a campaign slogan. Those who knew him knew it came from a fundamental value of work, right? Like fundamentally valued work. It came from, he would often tell the story when his dad, when he was young, when he would come to the kitchen table in the morning, if his dad's lunch pail was on the counter, that meant his dad was working. He was going to work and life was good. Like they had food, they had what they needed as a family. And if his dad's lunch pail was on the shelf, that meant that he wasn't working and things were tough for that family. So he had a fundamental appreciation for job, for work. And that connected. He was able to connect with people across. Because there's something about that work, I think, that we maybe don't value, quite honestly, the same way that Rudy did. And it goes beyond simply providing the necessities for a family, but it goes to providing dignity for a person and for a community. And I think there's no one else that had that ability to connect people across Minnesota and create a vision of what we can be. So I'm going to maybe wrap up this section. We'd love to take some questions. I thought I'd maybe just read a little bit from the area. So I read from the prologue earlier. I'm going to read from the epilogue. So Perpich loved being governor. More significantly, he understood what being governor meant and what a difference gubernatorial leadership could make for future generations. Perpich invested in the future because it could see that the dividends flowing from that investment would be required to keep improving, going forward, building, and innovating. Not all states have that. Rudy Perpich isn't solely responsible, but he deserves much of the credit for the enviable position Minnesotans find ourselves in today. He wasn't just paying bills. He wasn't just paying today's bills. He was planning for an even better future. When designing the state capitol, architect Cass Gilbert reserved places for Minnesota's greatest governors above the doors of the governor's reception area. Rudy let it be known that he would have a place with them one day. If they ever decide to follow through on that plan at the Capitol, there will be room for Rudy's boyhood political hero, Floyd B. Olson, for his progressive ideas that gave Minnesotans hope during the Depression and influenced the EFL to this day. There will be room for the man that Rudy befriended, Harold Stassen, who led Minnesota out of the Depression into a modern economy and laid a progressive vision of public politics to shape their state's policies for half a century. And there will be room for the immigrant son from the Iron Range.
That was fantastic.
Anyone have any questions? There's a lot of expertise in this. Ryan.
Thanks, Ben, both for the talk and for the book. It was, I got to read the beta version, so apologies for all the darlings we had to leave on the cutting room floor, but as a reader of the book, not just as an editor, as a reader, and as a Minnesotan, the thing that struck me so much chapter after chapter was Rudy not as the kind of cartoon character I remember portrayed as a kid, but as really serious politician, and I hesitate to say wonk, but somebody who understood the details and thought that the details really mattered for outcomes. And that was just a real surprise to me because that wasn't how his accomplishments were portrayed, at least in my experience. So I'm wondering for you, as you were digging into the research and reading and thinking and trying to assemble this narrative in your own head, what were the big surprises in your own mind of how did your perception of Rudy change over the course of writing the book?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I didn't go into it with a lot of. I didn't know the story of Rudy Perpich. In fact, I'm a little bit embarrassed to say, I didn't know. It was before my time in politics. I was young during this time. I didn't know if he was a Democrat or Republican, which is kind of maybe a good thing, right? And so I didn't have a lot of the, it did surprise me the degree to which he was caricatured as this governor goofy, you know, and maybe there was things, you know, like, that I didn't capture in the newspaper or something like that, but, yeah, he was a vision, like, he could see, what's great, what's surprising is reading the accounts from the 1980s, or 1970s, 1980s, and we see these things that are today, like the Mall America, like, I mean, like, to think, like, to read about how they criticized him, it would have been hard, I think, for, you know, just to constantly have been criticized like that, and then maybe not to ever see some of the things that how they fully came to be, because probably was challenging. I have to tell one story about Ryan though. Here's a story about having a really good editor. Okay, so I knew the epilogue was going to be the most difficult part to write because I was going to have to be like I couldn't rely on newspaper accounts or all histories or anything. I had to say like what I thought this meant. The lawyer was like, "Yeah, can't wait for you to write that. So tell him from a Minnesota mayor's perspective what all this means." And I kept putting it off and I finally got around to writing it. And I sent it off, and the lawyer's like, "Yay, that's perfect. Yeah, send that in." And I sent it to Ryan, and Ryan did a wonderful job editing, but there was not any major cuts. Not any major cuts. There's a few here and there, except for the epilogue. Like what I wrote, what I thought was important. And I wrote that in September of 2024. And I was writing something for the Star Tribune a couple weeks ago, and I went back and grabbed that because I thought, I'll use this for stuff. April 2025 is a very different time than September of 2024. And I'm so glad that that's not in the book, because I read that in my voice and I'm like, that's me from September of 2024. And I'm so glad that is not in the book. That is why you get yourself a good editor.
How do you know?
I highly doubt that my thought process was prophetic. I was just firmly held conviction that you stick the landing.
Yeah.
Succinct.
And it turned it up, and it's yeah. There's so much so much along the way. Yes, and
You referred to what you wanted to be on the cover of the magazine, and you held up the book. Wasn't that photo? And even if it wasn't, I remember that there was a story about that photo, but I don't remember what the story was. So would you please remind me?
yeah, you bet. So the story, the one I wanted on the cover of is on page 225. It's this one. It's him playing bocce.
Okay.
And because it's interesting because there is this quirkiness to Rudy Perpich. Even though he's very serious, I mean he's still like polka band, like the polka bands at his at his reception. In that story I read in the prologue, the thing that struck me about that was that Wendell Anderson, when he was his first inaugural, and just it was black tie, the Minnesota Orchestra played, and here comes Rudy Perpich in his coffee and cookie, and the Hibbing High School band. And that was just like, so there's things, there's a polka, there was bocce, he was trying to make bocce the state sport or something, so there is that quirkiness to him that you can pick up, but it didn't get in the way of him being really, really effective policy-wise and incredible. Like I think he's up until 87.
Those decisions about watching all those things, those were strategic reminders to the establishment that he wasn't one of them. I mean, he wanted it clear that he understood where his roots were, and he wanted people to understand that he wasn't leaving the fold. I mean, that was very intentional.
He got booed off the stage in Hibbing at the DFL convention in '82. He knew he wasn't going to run for the endorsement, but he went to the convention anyway, and they booed him off the stage. So he just went and got in his RVs and over on stage and connected with people one-on-one. It's kind of a remarkable story. picture here. So this is kind of a fun story. So this is November 2nd, 1982, and I knew that he was in Hibbing, and the Star Tribune has been up there, and there were a couple pictures in the Star Tribune on election day, 1982. And so going through the archives, the negatives in the archives of the Historical Society, and I came across this picture, and it had never been published. And it was just, I just found it, right? And which was kind of fun. So then I saw it, like, that's kind of cool. So then I had to produce, and then the story began. So then I asked if we could put it inside. So the full picture's here because on the cover it's great with this color and everything. But if you look inside the cover, it says, you know, this is a barber shop on Chestnut Street, Virginia, in Virginia, Minnesota. This is Clipper Fiala and Mark Phillips. Some of you might remember Mark Phillips. He was the I got to know so many people during this process, which was just so much fun. And they all had stories, and they all were just willing to share them. But we said, oh yeah, that's Clipper Fiala. He was the I tell the story with Mark said here, but it's kind of remarkable to think of, like 1982. This is a rural barbershop, which I can kind of relate to. This looks like a barbershop that where I get my haircut first of all, actually, right? And it's got Reagan on the wall, and it's got politicians' lives or tomorrow's taxes. And, you know, it's got all these. It's got a big muskie on the wall there, and it's got this big sign, handmade sign, vote Rudy Perpich, save Minnesota. It just kind of tells the story of how he was able to connect with people. And I thought that picture was really really interesting. So, yeah, that's the story. And another good piece of so I thought this is the title we're gonna pay. What we're gonna name this book? It had a working title of Purpose and News Original. I thought, what was the title I came up with? Polka Populism. And Ann said, thank you. Because that would have actually played into the stereotype. Anyone else have any questions? Well,
Yeah. I wonder if your picture of Minnesota changed as you were writing the book, as you were researching and learning more about it. Did you develop a more kind of complex picture of your home state than you had before you started?
yeah, that's a wonderful question. I think that what it did is it reinforced, like, so if you'll notice, like in the book, you can tell I highlight times from a rural perspective, right? Like the stories and the times that he's like, connecting with rural places. You know, I try to just tell the story. And I think it's obvious that I'm a fan of it. But I try to be honest. And there's a couple chapters here that were hard to write because the story does not end like I wish it would end. Right? But what it did for me, I think more than anything, is I saw these places that I know now, places in Ottertail. Rudy Perpich won Ottertail County in 1982. He's the last gubernatorial candidate to win Ottertail. Now, if you know Ottertail County, where I'm from, what did I say?
You just said Canada.
Oh, last DFLer
Yeah.
to win Ottertail County. I mean, now it's like 70-30 now, 65-35. It's not close. So to think that Rudy Perpich was able to do that is really important, right? Because I would make the argument I'm a DFL. But even if you're not a DFL, I would make the argument, same thing in Minneapolis. Really. I think that we're better when we have both parties competing in an area so we can get the competition of ideas and brings us together, right? And that's something we did back then. And so I think about these little towns and these rural places of our state that were once part of the conversation that we're having here tonight, that are no longer part of that. He was able to connect to, and I think we can get back. I really think we can get back. It's not going to be easy. You know, that was 40 years ago, and it's been 40 years of there's reasons for that. It's not just in Minnesota, obviously, but that was the most important thing. Like I saw a state that like they're still the same people. It's just our politics is like changing.
I just kept writing about healthcare, I kept writing about agriculture, I kept writing about, and they printed everything I wrote, and I thought, well, I'll probably never win in this red district, but I can talk about ideas, it'd be a valuable, and then I ended up winning,
Yeah.
But the newspapers, don't you think nobody here is as old as I am,
Well, I
but-
am.
that's what we are, aren't we? Yeah, that's what we are. But I think we're really missing something by not having our local newspapers everywhere.
Yeah.
Did you, how did local newspapers fit in your research?
Well, newspapers.com is amazing. I was able to, and it was the first one, Daily Journal was on there, and, all these editorials, I'm trying to think now the list is in the book, but there's all kinds of small local newspapers that were really important, right? They were writing editorials. Like I remember going back and reading the editorials that were written in the Fergus Falls Daily Journal newspaper. I was like, oh, it's kind of remarkable. Yeah, you're right. Local journalism is incredible to our democracy. That's just fundamental to our democracy.
I'm struggling to frame a question that will get Marlene to chime in with some personal witness. Partly because I've heard some of these stories and read it. But, I'm thinking about this thread that you've been talking about idiosyncrasies that the press emphasized that were truly there, perhaps strategically exercised to communicate something. But, I was new to the state in 77, 78 and kind of watching all of this, and I got that same version of it, right? But I also saw him produce, and I'm wondering, a little cynicism about the media. It's so much easier to write a story that has some kind of clever book, that has some quirky thing that you can do a good headline and then they'll read it. And I wonder if there was a little symbiotic thing going on there. I don't know, did you hear him talk about the way he was covered, or?
Yeah, I think, some of it initially he did to himself. When he was governor the first time for 2 years, unplugged all the coffee pots in the state offices.
They were still talking about that when I started.
Exactly. So,
Yeah.
those were self-inflicted wounds that I think he didn't do that in our term. But I think some of that press cynicism comes from the fact that the press is part of the establishment. And they're used to covering the two parties who behave very differently. And Rudy really was the first original. Subsequently, I just lost his name, the rest of it. Jesse, gave them some, by the time Jesse was elected, they were not as, I think they were more generous, partly because they had the experience of Perpich, but also Jesse's essentially created a cabinet that was 50-50 Republican and Democrat, and most of the Democrats that he chose had been our deputies. Pam Whitney and that whole crowd, they were our deputies and they became his commissioners. And so, the press by then understood something more about how these characters like Rudy and Jesse operated. And I think Rudy had a much, much deeper understanding of policy than Jesse. Jesse did amazingly well in my view, considering where he came from and stuff. But Rudy was deeply grounded in policy and the philosophy of government. And that came, as you talked about, from his childhood, from his experience on the school board, from living among Native American people and seeing Native women being raped and left by the side of the road. Those kinds of injustices that he grew up seeing never left him. Never. And in private conversations, he would talk about his upbringing and his education. He was educated as a dentist, which is kind of a singular job as opposed to the policy monk kind of way. So I think one of the reasons he didn't get as much credit as he should have had was that the administration wasn't structured to do that work. I mean, we just didn't, the administration did not have a really, well-honed communication strategy team. I believe it's his fault. I mean, I believe that we leaders get what we want. So he didn't identify that that's what he wanted, so he didn't get it. So I'm not, you know, I think Gary Truman was right, the buck stops at one place, and, you know, we have to live with our decisions, and we did not make the right decision in that regard. And, you know, it's, Joe Biden made a similar mistake. You know, so Perpich is not the only one who made that mistake. But I think that's part of it. And then, you know, but the press, I think, their problem had a lot to do with the fact that they are establishment. And they never took me seriously. I mean, never. The only person who took me seriously at all was Logan. I mean, if you read Betty Wilson's first book, about Rudy, you know, that's how they felt about me. Yeah, so, I mean, that's just a mindset. That has nothing to do with what's real, because they weren't paying attention. I mean, they just weren't interested. So the fact that I had a children's agenda for the administration and all those things, I mean, they just weren't interested. Because they didn't think it was important, because this was the first time that a lieutenant governor had ever had an assignment. And that was intentional on Rudy's part, because he had been a lieutenant governor that didn't, I don't know if you write this, but he told me, I don't know if it's in the literature anywhere, it's in my book, but that he never had one private meeting with Wendell Anderson when he was Wendy's lieutenant governor. Not one private conversation with him in 6 years. So he,
The paper had a headline that said, Wendell Anderson told him that Tom Helm, right, was Wendy's chief of staff. And he told the media that when he was going somewhere, Tom Helm was going to be in charge. But that didn't sit well with Rudy, obviously. It's in the headline, there was Tom Helm to be number 2 in the state.
I would just, sorry, because I have a little bit of experience in actually on both sides of the farm, right? In the press and now in politics. I think where that's coming, some of where that's coming from, what you just talked about is, and I can guarantee you, the newsrooms of the 70s and 80s, all over the state, were filled with the same cut of jaded, great big white man who wrote all these stories. And I did 20 years in journalism, and I guarantee you, everyone assumes that if you get to a position like a governor, that you're in it for the wrong reasons. It's just like there is no grace. And the other thing I would just point out on the editorial side is that when Paul Simon, the former senator, ran for president,
I love that man. He was a lieutenant governor too.
he was a lieutenant governor of a different party. The governor was a different party.
Yes.
He had the bow tie. He flamed out after Illinois, and the editorial cartoon the next day was, "There goes the editorial cartoonist's vote," because he had this face and this bow tie, and so did Rudy. And I think in some ways Rudy probably got some gruff just from how charismatic he appeared. I mean, the editorial cartoonists would have fun, and so then the editorial board would say, "Well, if you're going to do that cartoon, we'll make fun of the toothpick factory or something."
Well, he was a lot more interesting in that regard than a bunch of those Norwegians and Swedes.
Right.
I mean, really.
That's right.
He was just more clever. Everything came out of his mouth was clever, even when it wasn't articulate. I mean, really, it was just,
And he, you know,
and he loved to laugh. You know, his laugh alone would bring the house down. He was just such a warm person. He was fun to do.
speaking of old Norwegians, so Spanish was the heir apparent in 82.
Lucky for me, that's all I can say.
Marie Perpich chose Marlene Johnson, and he won that one by about 20,000 votes.
I think 23 or 25,000. We were outspent 10-1. Just,
Oh.
the party spent $1 million and we spent 100,000.
When I saw this book was coming out, my immediate reaction was, oh, I hope whoever wrote that read that article that was in Minnesota History. I swear to God. I swear to God. Because
That's great.
that story was so close. He went to sleep, he had to wake him up.
Yeah,
Tell him he won.
he was out at
He wouldn't
Lake
answer the phone.
Escalante.
I
Went
was-
to the phone, he had to go knock on the window.
And I
I
didn't
remember
realize.
when Sandy Keith called me and said, you have to come down and accept the nomination. I said, he's not waking up. Okay, I will put it up, whatever to do.
I was talking to Matt McNeil from 9:50 a.m. or whatever the other day I was looking. I didn't realize Matt McNeil had a cabin out on Lake Escalante. I didn't realize that's 40 minutes away from Woody too. So they just go across town to wake him up. A little 40-minute drive, just to wake him up. Well, I just want to say thanks everyone for coming tonight, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Thanks so much to Minnesota